I'm welcoming Joe Hirsch to Potential to Powerhouse. And what I want to just describe for everyone before we dialogue is whether or not I have what I know to be the background and the experience of your relationship with Karen Eldad, who's my dear friend and my professional and personal coach, who helped catalyst and transition me in so many ways over the last 3 years. She absolutely said you need to meet Joe Hirsch because he has something for you that will change not only your life, but your listener's life. And this is the nuts and bolts of it. Joe Hirsch is an expert at helping individuals learn how to deliver feedback to people in their lives without fear. And that, in fact, your premise, as I understand it, is that feedback is a gift, and that feedback creates fearless leaders, better organizations, better relationships with your spouse and your loved ones, and that ultimately being a problem solver is one half of the equation. The other half of the equation is learning how to deliver feedback without fear. And so I would love to know, how did I do?
I think you did great, Tracy. I give you high marks on that. So let's start with an intention here, because that's the best way to begin all of our conversations and, in fact, all of our learnings. And that is that feedback, it is a gift, but more importantly, it's a cause for joy and not fear. And if we change our message and our mindset around feedback, then the act of giving and getting feedback will be something that we ultimately cherish, keep, and act on, because it is in fact a gift, and it's a gift that we'll keep giving.
Okay, so I want to dig into this because I think what you just said just resonated for me so much, which is what some of my most memorable conversations with people in my life who I love and who love me have been what I would call difficult or tough conversations that we've had in which the person has given me feedback or I've had to give them feedback in order to right the relationship, so to speak. How and why, I guess I'm questioning, why would it be that is the case, that those are some of my most memorable moments with them, even though when I hindsight those thoughts around that conversation, I remember my physicality, my emotionality, my being so constricted, tight, stomach ache, gurgling, prickly skin. And I remember all of those physical reactions going on while having these, what I would call more honest, raw, open conversations in which I heard or had to deliver feedback. So talk to me about what that is.
Well, what you experienced probably in that moment was a sense of growth. And growth hurts. Growth is challenging. Growth is painful. And growth pushes us past our boundaries. It sets a new expectation for us, a new premise of who we can become. And so all growth is hard. The challenge with a lot of feedback is that feedback isn't about growth, and it's not about goals. It's about goading people. It's about rules and not relationships. It's about accountability and not agency. And it's about fear and not joy. And so under those conditions, most people recoil from those conversations. As you pointed out, they physically feel changed. They feel like less of themselves and not more. And that's why you and I probably know people who have no problem jumping out of planes, diving off of cliffs, or otherwise swimming with things that might actually eat them. But the thought, Tracy, of giving feedback or getting feedback from someone about our work, it's terrifying. Because at that moment, the conversation is no longer about who we can be. It's about who we weren't. And it's no longer playing to our strengths, but our weaknesses.
It's just so much to unpack, Joe. Okay. So I think one thing that is resonating for me so deeply here is this idea that when we give feedback, it actually, the first 1 to 2 sentences as to how you deliver that feedback has everything to do with how the next 10 to 15 minutes is going to go, doesn't it? Because I can say to my partner, my spouse, my employee, listen, I have feedback for you. I'd like you to take a seat. You and I are going to have a discussion because I really would like to unpack or have a conversation candidly about what happened yesterday or what took place. And I have some thoughts for you or some feedback. That that way of starting that conversation and what that's going to trigger in myself and in that other person, because it's both ways, is literally an electrical, I feel it like it's an electric experience where you're tangibly, physically experiencing, embracing yourself on what's to come, versus I could say the exact same thing in a tee-up that says something very much with the same intention of giving feedback, but say, hey, buddy, or hey, sweetheart, I wanted to revisit with you something that I thought of yesterday that I just think it would be interesting to hear your perspective on. But when this took place yesterday, I I found myself really frustrated. And I was trying to figure out why. And when I figured out why, here's why. And I could actually give the exact same feedback ultimately with a completely different outcome. So help me understand that piece of it, because I think people listening right now hear the word feedback and that word triggers them to think, oh God, here we go. Right?
Yeah, I think it starts even before we open our mouths. It starts from the very first moment we make a decision to give feedback, because at that moment, we have to change our whole mindset around feedback. And in fact, maybe even change the word itself. Because when I wrote the feedback fix, I realized that feedback as a concept is fear inducing, is stress provoking, makes people feel depleted and defeated, not renewed and restored. And so I set out to explore the research, the science, the strategies, but more importantly, the beliefs and behaviors. And I came up with something that I like to call Feedforward. It's a concept that was first introduced by Marshall Goldsmith as a way to get quick feedback, especially when you're trying to solve very quick problems. And with Marshall's support and blessing, I unpack the science and strategies of Feedforward. And here's ultimately what Feedforward is meant to achieve. It is a whole new way of thinking about people and performance. It
Hmm.
is a bold and better view of who people can become and not just who they are. It is the new fuel of feedback, because instead of taking a backwards looking position on who people were, the mistakes, the missteps, it
Hmm.
looks out towards a future they can still control. It sees them not as problems, but problem solvers. And it ultimately trades power for partnership. And so,
Hmm.
this mindset, Tracy, of thinking about another person as your partner in a process of change and development, and seeing yourself as the feedback giver, not so much as someone who is here to do something to another person, but for another person. That is a
Hmm.
completely new way of thinking about this act of feedback. And with Feed Forward, we totally change the dynamics, we change the tone, and ultimately we change the trajectory so that the message that follows is something that people actually want to hear and act on.
Hmm. Well, and so I'm curious for those listening, because ultimately, what you're going to teach us how to do today and what we're going to talk about is going to make the people who are listening better partners, better leaders, better entrepreneurs, better neighbors, better community leaders. All of these things are, I believe that this, and what I've learned and how I've learned to approach feedback from you just in reading and watching your TED Talks, is so valuable because it completely shifts the energetic dynamic of what you're about to do. And if we think about it, giving feedback is just as vital and actually, frankly, as common as eating breakfast, going on a run. We're giving feedback actually every single day that we wake up. Between the time we wake up, the time we go to bed, we're giving feedback to the world, whether it's in a positive way and we're getting the outcomes we're hoping for and want or not, is a whole different conversation, which is what I want us to all learn from you today. But I think those listening need to understand that you are an absolute category expert in the area of giving feedback, and you're trusted by PepsiCo, Liberty Mutual, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. You've done multiple TED Talks. You're an international keynote speaker with Fortune 500 companies. So I'd say to those listening today, buckle in, get out your pen and paper. We're going to put together some very specific conversations and techniques that will help the listener have an understanding for what positive, effective feedback sounds and looks like versus that could maybe be counterintuitive and not inducing the feedback or the outcome that you want. But before we jump into the how, and I'd love to understand your why, if we could just back up, because I can't imagine Joe Hirsch as a little guy growing up was thinking, gosh, I'm going to become the world's most renowned leader in giving feedback. This is my life's mission. So I'm curious for those listening, what your pivot point was to getting you to the place where you decided to start doing this as your full-time life's work.
Not only did I not ever think that was going to happen, if you look back at my younger self, and we're not talking like 20, 30 years ago, younger self, we're talking 5 to 7 years ago, younger self was absolutely not the person who gave or received feedback fearlessly. In fact, I was quite the opposite. I was actually terrified of finding out what others actually thought of me. I was much more inclined to go through life blissfully unaware about what others thought because I thought I had it all figured out. I thought that I was a high performer. My record was good. My work was strong. I had racked up wins in my work, doing a job that I loved. I was respected by the people I worked with. But what I didn't realize, Tracy, is that I wasn't actually very well liked. And I had huge blind spots because of my inability to seek feedback and to approach those performance conversations with humility and curiosity. And because of those blind spots, I actually got myself into quite a bit of trouble, something I talked about in my TED Talk. And it ultimately cost me relationships and nearly cost me my job. And as I reflected afterwards on that period in my life, I can now say that I'm not only grateful, I feel blessed actually that I went through that, because I would not have come out on the other side with a more humble, curious, and engaged outlook on the power of feedback if it's designed and delivered the right way, that it activates our true sense of self and purpose and doesn't defeat us and deflate us. So for me, that turning point was that moment in my career where everything kind of came to a head. Years and years of blind spots finally cost me my vision and nearly cost me everything I cared about. Years of building up strong relationships crumbled seemingly overnight. A job that I adored was almost taken from me. And it got me thinking, what is it about feedback that makes it so fearful, that causes people like me to run from it rather than run towards it? And as I started to unpack the science and strategies of effective communication and really look at the research on this, because it is a research-based study, I began to understand that really good feedback starts with changing the way we think about the entire enterprise. It is no longer about what we do to others. It's what we do for them. It's no longer about power. It's about partnership. It's no longer about ratings only. It's about relationships. And it's about activating people's deepest desires for agency and for affirmation, and not pinning them to a past that they can't change or control. And so once I started to understand that, I shared some of these ideas in the Feedback Fix. I began talking about them and sharing this, this body of work with audiences here in the United States and around the world. And ultimately, what I discovered was a very basic human truth. You can't go back and change the past, but you can start right where you are and fix the future. And it's something I hope and wish for all of us, that we can fix the future for others and for ourselves, because when we do, we are doing something beautiful for others. We are helping them achieve the potential that resides deep inside them, that is ready to be unlocked and unleashed if we just give them the chance.
Can you walk us through, I mean, very tactically, that week or that day? Was there something that, because the person you were and the person you are today and the journey is obviously a journey, but what was it that helped, like, what was the stopping point or moment that you said, holy smokes?
So I think there was a hurry up and wait moment for me. Everything seemed to happen very quickly. Events that I was going through at that time turned pretty quickly. And so within a matter of weeks, my reality was completely upended. So yeah, there was that sudden burst, but then it was more like a slow drip. And there was actually one person, a really, really good friend who knew me very well for years, not a work person, a relationship person who I trusted and who trusted me. And that individual asked me a very simple question. He said, Joe, who do you want to be? And in that moment, I realized what I had been missing, because what he had done for me was essentially hold a mirror up for me to look and think and commit. And while it sounds simplistic, the act of mirror holding that this close friend of mine did for me literally changed my view overnight and gave me then the right perspective to begin the work of repairing and restoring the relationships and even the parts of myself that needed to be fixed. And so I went on to think about that a lot in the weeks that followed, when things kind of settled down and life seemed to return to its normal rhythms. What is it about the act of mirror holding that is so transformative? And that's why I talk about this all the time, Tracy, because mirror holding is sort of the essential act of Feedforward. Because when you hold a mirror to someone, you are no longer focusing on your view as the feedback giver, as the feedback gazer. You're actually focused on someone else's view, the view of the other person on the other side of that conversation. And your job is simply to enlarge and expand that person's perspective and to transfer more understanding and power and permission to that person to see things for themselves. Feedforward, when you act like this, when you act like a mirror holder, is all about showing people where to look, but not telling them what to see. And that act of mirror holding gives them the perspective they may not have had, gives them the permission they may have lacked or thought they lacked, and ultimately accords them the partnership that they need to make meaningful, lasting changes and improvements in their behaviors in their world. And so for me, mirror holding became almost a battle cry when it came to talking about this stuff, when it came to thinking about this, because ultimately, if we approach as a mirror holder, as opposed to a window gazer, someone who is telling and selling, as opposed to listening and learning, then what we're going to do is give people the tools, the techniques, and most importantly, the transformation that they need to be able to unlock and unleash the change and the potential that is residing deep inside them and just waiting to emerge.
Interesting. And what's incredible about what you're saying is, as a mirror holder, what a gift, first of all, that is. And secondly, without telling someone what to look at or how to change. And I want to ask you about that because, you know, there's something in feedback that says, I'm going to try and control how you act next time. I think depending on how you approach the conversation, right? But ultimately, the feedback giver, I don't think is selfless in saying, I want to hold a mirror so that you can see what you don't see. The feedback giver is a person saying, hey, buddy, I didn't like how you delivered that presentation to clients yesterday. Here's what cannot happen again. And so let's talk through what my expectations are, how you see it, and then figure out a new go forward plan. And sometimes the person who's giving the feedback is in hope that you'll see a market or radical change, but the person receiving the feedback may not agree that the client presentation yesterday wasn't great and needs to shift. And so therefore you're not getting the outcome. So I guess in this idea of holding the mirror, giving feedback, how do we do that in a way, or is there two separate versions of this? One that's really like, I want to be a mirror holder. I love my son or my daughter and I want them to see what they don't see, versus try and control an outcome or change a circumstance so that it doesn't happen next time.
It's a great question. And the goal is not to force a change, but to provoke an insight. And that insight has to come from the other person. Because if I force a change on you, again, if I impose my will, as opposed to giving you the will to do something different or better, then we might see a short-term fix or short-term change. And that often happens, right? Leaders will impose or demand that something happen, and something will usually happen as a result, but it's short-lived. So ultimately, as leaders, we have to decide who's going to own this change. Is it going to be me or is it going to be you? If I decide to own the change, then I better be prepared for short-term results and no long-term improvement, because unless I'm prepared to literally hold my hand to the problem, it's never going to go away. But if I decide that my time is better spent empowering you rather than using my power to change you, then what I'm going to do is give you the permission, but also the perspective through this partnership approach that allows you to find your way together with me as your partner and ultimately decide on a solution that works for you on your terms and your timetable. So this is something I operationalize with leaders in terms of how to actually give over this message in a way that is candid, but also caring and always collaborative. But before you get into the how or the messaging, it really starts with the mattering with what you're thinking when you go into this conversation. And so always operate with the premise of, I don't have all the facts, even though I have the power, possibly. I need to be more curious as a leader, as the feedback giver, as the manager, because rather than being a know-it-all who may get only a part of the picture, it's much better to be a learn-it-all who's going to try to gather as much information and complete the picture as it really should be presented. And finally, I have to be someone who exercises the greatest power of leadership, and that is to give power away. Because when we give that away, Tracy, it's not that we are giving things up. Because when we transfer power, it's not what we give up, it's what we give. Because we're giving people the permission and giving them the potential to own this change, to be people who are seen as partners and not pawns, to be seen as human beings. Because feedback, as you pointed out earlier, it's the most human thing we do. It follows us around everywhere we go, to work, at home, and everywhere in between, but it rarely feels human. And the way to start fixing that is to start treating people in these conversations like humans, like partners, And rather than doing to them, doing for them. So mindset, but also message.
Holy smokes. If everyone listening isn't pausing for a moment and saying, hold on, can I rewind this? I need to listen to this one more time because this is so important. Because ultimately, what I heard from your messaging and everything you've written and your approach is so important. If you're coming from a place of overpower or power over and control and force, and the outcome is going to be different because I'm going to impose upon you everything I'm giving you in terms of feedback, and I expect you to shift and change. And your point is, they may in the short term, but it's not going to bring an enlightened vision for who they could be, and therefore you're actually shortchanging yourself because you're not going to get the long-term results if you step back and say, okay, and this is challenging, right? Because sometimes feedback comes from a place of frustration in that immediate place of saying, I'm going to give this person feedback. I don't like how they drove my kid to school and were texting while driving my child. I heard from my kid, he was in the car and she was on the phone and texting. I'm giving her feedback. That's one example. But like, I think everyone listening who's a parent would say, I'm pretty fired up about hearing that from my kid. And I'm definitely going to give the person who drove my son to school some feedback about texting while driving, right? So to me, that's an example of where we get an opportunity to grow. And so in that specific example, Joe, how would you help me think about giving feedback to the woman driving or the man driving my son to school, finding out they were texting? Help me, like, practically speaking, can you walk me through what you would tell me to do?
The biggest problem with telling and selling is that we're operating from a point of blindness. And that's why feedback is such a fearful experience, because ultimately we are kind of working in the dark. Whether we are the person giving or receiving that feedback, a lot of times that conversation is happening hours, days, weeks, months, even after it's happened. And as soon as there's a time gap and a lapse from the time that something occurs to the time that something is actually discussed, our recollection, our ability to remember is severely impaired. And memory researchers have done a lot of work on this, and they refer to it as something they call as a forgetting curve. And it kind of operates the way it sounds. As soon as we learn information, as soon as information hits our dashboards, we immediately start to forget. And the picture becomes blurry and not clear. And within 24 hours, as much as 50% of that information is blurry or disappeared. And over time, over the next several days, it steadies, but it also steepens. So that by the time, a week goes by, almost 90% of that information is lost. Now, if that's a conversation that's happening between a manager and an employee 3 months later around a scheduled performance check-in, you can imagine how much fear, unknowing, and defensiveness goes into those conversations, because we're no longer operating with facts. In your example with, I just heard from my kid. Well, maybe that happens at what, 8:30, carpool came around, mom came to pick the kid up, and I hearing about it later at 4 p.m. after drop off. That's a significant amount of time. Now, what happened in the course of that day, right? Your kid had a whole experience at school. So many things happened, and now the child's reporting back to you. So in that moment, do you really have all the information, right? So if you were to start the conversation by saying, I can't believe you drove like that. My son told me that you were texting while driving and you were taking calls. It's totally not okay. Like, we talked about this. This is the second time it's happened in 2 weeks. So if you operate that way, you are immediately triggering the fear response, because that person, the person driving carpool, is now immediately thrust into a threat response, because his or her status is challenged and his or her safety is questioned. And that's what happens whenever we are in these feedback conversations. Our status, our safety, our sense of self, it literally goes dark. I mean, we've got brain scans that show the effects neurologically of feedback on people when they're thrust into a state of toxic stress. The parts of their brains that are responsible for creativity, for executive functioning. Tracy, the parts of us that make us us, they go dark whenever we feel like we're not our full selves. And that's what happens in these conversations. So what if you changed the dynamic from blame to curiosity? And one of the ways that I advise organizations and leaders to do this is by changing the nature of the conversation from telling and selling to listening and learning. And one great way to do that is this beautiful 4-part plan that I call a feedback wrap, WRAP. And the wrap is a beautiful way to wrap up these conversations, to change the dynamics from fear to joy, from power to partnership, and ultimately from accountability to agency, because you don't just want to change something now. You want to create the conditions that allow that to be improved over time, not just this one time. And so ultimately, it's about creating the conditions using this 4-step process to give people a sense of agency, of ownership, and ultimately to feel like they are seen, heard, and trusted to make the decisions they need to, that you want and they need.
Okay, so can we role play this? Can we role play a wrap session? So let's say I'm the nanny and
Okay.
I drove your son to school and you're coming home to have that conversation with me. I'm the nanny. So I just walk into the kitchen. What happens?
All right. First thing is W, what and where. You want to try to give the feedback a location, give it a zip code, because we can never really take all the fear out of feedback, but we can contain it. And so by opening the conversation by saying, hey, Tracy, can we talk about what happened earlier today when you drove my son Johnny to school? He said a few things to me. I just wanted to check with you and have a conversation. Can we find a time to do that? Now is now a good time. And by the way, that's just a side point about asking for permission. Even if you don't need to, it's still good practice, right? Whether you're the leader, whether you're the person, you're the parent, you're paying this person, you still want to ask permission, because it's all about creating the conditions that de-escalate fear, tension, and conflict. So asking for permission is now a good time, and giving it a location, the what and the where, that's how you start. So you talk about what happened and where it happened. Yeah, Johnny told me this morning, like, you drove 70 miles an hour in a 35 zone. Like, wow, that's pretty surprising. He also said that you were talking to your friend while that happened and then looked down at your phone to change the Spotify channel. So I was a little bit concerned when I heard that. You then go to R, the reason. And there's a few reasons to give the reason. The first is to address people's need for certainty, right? They just want to know what this is all about. So I want to have this feedback conversation because I'm rightfully concerned about my child's safety and yours, frankly. So give the reason, put that in the context. But the other big reason to give the reason is to show that you care. I want to have this conversation with you, Tracy, because I know how much you care about my son. I know how much you care about my family. That's why I've entrusted them in your care. And I know how much you appreciate being a part of our family and how much we appreciate having you being a part of that family. So communicating care is a big part of Feedforward, because as cliche as it sounds, people don't care what you know until they know that you care. And ultimately, Feedforward is not just about being candid, but also about being caring. Because if feedback is a gift, then the gift has to be something that has some thought that goes into it, that has some love that goes into it, that is ultimately about a relationship. Because the best gifts that I've ever gotten, I don't know about you, They're the ones that have come from people who truly understand what I need. And they've taken the time and the effort to think about, how can I express my affection for you or my desire to fill your needs by giving you this gift? And so if we think of feedback as a gift, then it's not just the act of feedback that's a gift, it's the intention that underlies it.
Mm.
And so I have to express that that conviction of caring to the person who I'm talking to, because if that is absent, if that reason is not there, then nothing that I say next is going to resonate or change.
Mm. Huge. This is
Huge,
big.
huge,
Huge. Okay,
huge.
so I'm like sitting at the edge of my seat.
All right. So A is for affects. And here's where this wrap approach really goes into high gear. With Feedforward, it's never about blame. It's always about contribution. And this is the part where feedback moves away from errors and shifts towards a focus on efficacy. Because ultimately, it's not just about making people feel better about themselves. It's about helping them do better for themselves. And the way we can do that is by being very clear about the impact that this had on you, on them, on others. So in this example, moving away from blame, which would sound like, I can't believe you drove 70 in a 35 zone. I can't believe you were looking at your phone. Like, what were you thinking? Were you even thinking? Which is a blame statement, which is a trigger for people, because now in an act of self-preservation, I want to save myself. I want to save my reputation. I want to save my dignity. And so you, as the nanny in this example, you are coming right back at me with an explanation, maybe not with a sense of power, because you may feel powerless in that moment, but you definitely want to explain yourself. But if I were to say to you, Tracy, I felt badly for Johnny that this had to happen. He obviously was nervous enough, scared enough, maybe even traumatized enough by it to want to tell it to me immediately as soon as he came home. It was the first thing he told me when he walked in the door. I can only imagine what was going through his mind all day as he got to school, maybe feeling relieved, but also terrified. Like, what happens when I have to do this again in 7 hours? And so, and I felt bad, I felt bad for you, because now he's questioning his relationship with you. He's questioning whether he can ever get into a car with you again. And if you were to shift this for a moment outside sort of the dining room and move it into the boardroom or even the classroom, you can imagine how these conversations really take a turn for the better when you start focusing on efficacy instead of errors. Because as soon as I start with blame, you are becoming defensive, you are denying, you are defying. But when I approach with a sense of inquiry and I say, I wonder how that felt, for the other members of our team. I wonder how that felt for our client. I wonder how that felt for the other students in class. I wonder how this feels for you hearing this now. And so affect changes the dynamic. It de-escalates the tension and the fear by putting this into safer, sturdier ground. Because we can argue with what people say, Tracy, but we're less likely to argue with how they feel. So if we shift from judgments to feelings, that's a better place for us. It's a better place for the conversation.
This makes so much sense to me. Okay. And so P.
So P, the most important part of all, the prompt, is where Feedforward really delivers magical, transformational results for the giver and for the receiver. Because after I've talked about what's happening and where it's happening, after I've given you the reason for why I'm having the conversation and communicated my caring in addition to my candor, and after I've talked about the affective and talked about the impact of how this is landing, not just on me, but others as well, this is the moment where I enlist you as a partner in the process of your own improvement. I say to you, Tracy, so what do you think? What are your thoughts? Where do we go from here? And then I stop and I listen. I really
Hmm.
listen. I do. Because again, I don't know everything. And this was something that was a big aha for me because I used to think feedback was about just forcing the change, telling someone your truth, your version of events, and then waiting for them to agree or disagree, but ultimately to accept whatever it is that you share. But now I've realized that it's not about what we're doing to, but for other people. And when you enlist them as a partner, you need to give them room and space to act like a partner. So listen to what they have to say. Now, I've seen one of two things happen whenever people get to this point in the conversation. And most of my work focuses with leaders and their teams who are trying to design and deliver better feedback environments. But I've worked with schools, I've worked with families, and it's always the same two outcomes. Most likely outcome is that the person who has just gotten a rap expresses gratitude and relief because now they feel like they can finally share because they've been seen. They can finally have a say because they've been heard. They feel like you have my back instead of you're stabbing me in the back. And they may offer a suggestion that's even better than the one that you were thinking, or maybe even the same one that you were thinking. But guess what? It's theirs. It's their solution to the problem. And so they're more likely to own it and they're more likely to act on it. That happens a lot of the time, probably 75%. But there are times, I've seen it. I don't want to sugarcoat this or be inauthentic with your listeners. There are times when people go through these steps, especially in the context of work, and the person who has just received a rap pauses and says, actually, I disagree with everything you just said. I actually have a lot to say about what you just said. I actually completely deny your premise. I don't agree with anything. And they rant and they rave and they deny and they defy. But you know what, Tracy? That's still a good thing. Because at least now you know, as the feedback giver, that having packaged your feedback this way with candor and caring and collaboration, that there must be something else going on here underneath the surface. This is no longer about how someone spoke at a meeting or how fast they drove the kid to school or, whether they were talking over classmates, in the classroom during the lesson. This is about something much more deep-seated. So at least now you know, and ultimately that's what Feedforward is designed to do. It is designed to look out to a future that both I, the giver, and you, the receiver, can co-create, that we can work on together. And we can't do that unless there's information that's flowing through two-way dialogue and unless there is clarity and connection. And to do that, we have to know what's happening. And unless I give up a little power and act as a partner, we're never going to know that.
And this is so fascinating because I'm thinking about past experiences, especially with employees, in which that cognitive dissonance, that defensiveness, and actually, the unrooting of some of the other things that are sitting behind that they start to talk about has a whole nother opportunity for the conversation that says, gosh, it sounds like you're really unhappy here. Is this the right fit for you? Is this job still the right job for you? Is this still the right fit? And for those who have been really difficult employees at times and potentially difficult, not only internally and unhappy, but also would be a potential liability on their way to leave, has resolved a lot of what would have been bad feelings by saying, gosh, you're right. I have been unhappy and it's not just work. This is what's happening for me at home. And here's where I am in my career. And I'm having second thoughts about what I even want to do with my career. And sometimes it just opens up this tremendous amount of trust and dialogue around something that everybody's scared to talk about and discuss. And yet what this wrap process does to me, at least in how I'm thinking about some of the ways in which I've applied that last P, is for that 25% that says, you know what? I totally think you're out to lunch and here's why. And I don't like this and I'm upset about this. And when I come to work, I don't like how I feel about this. It's like just actively listening and being present to allow that person to really go deep and let go and be present with them instead of reflecting back defensiveness in their feedback allows that full conversation to come back full circle to say, gosh, what what I'm hearing is that it sounds like you're really unhappy here. Is this still feel like the right fit for you? And that can completely change the entire outcome of what, because employees come and go, right? Things change within the scope of people's careers and their passions and the things that they're doing. And rather than make that a contentious or painful or difficult conversation, it can be just very open and kind and loving and raw, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's always a cost to speaking in code, which we do way too often when it comes to these high stakes conversations. And the key is to move it out of this realm of high stakes and put it into the context of high touch. Feedback is about relationships. It's not about reports. It's not about ratings. And while there has to be a measure of accountability, clearly, I mean, the organizations I work with have a high degree of accountability for work. They are accountable to their stakeholders. They are accountable to their investors. They are accountable to their customers, and they have a high degree of accountability in the workplace. But they are realizing, many for the first time, that rules without relationships is rebellion. It's crazy. It leads people to rebel against the process, to rebel against their workplaces, to want to leave or to quietly quit, as many are doing now. And ultimately, the cost of not having the conversation severely outweighs the cost of inaction or silence. And this has a whole developmental side to it, like as you're pointing out, it doesn't have to be corrective in its nature. Feedforward is used most of the time by a lot of the folks I work with in a developmental context. They use it alongside their existing performance management practices. They don't throw out their ratings altogether. They want to soften those ratings with a more human, more rigorous, but also relaxed approach where there's a rhythm to this. There's a cadence to the feedback. It's happening as naturally as any other check-in about work. And by making it more natural and making it seem less fearful and high stakes, that's where we can start to make people feel more comfortable sharing, but also more willing to act on the information because they know they've got a trusted partner in you, the feedback giver, and they know that you care. And when we know that people care about us, we're more willing to do for them because they're doing for us.
So true. Joe, wow. I mean, thank you for sharing your wisdom and your expertise. And I know there are so many folks who are going to want to learn more. So I think first of all, we need to make sure that we let people know how to reach you or what the best approach is. Should they go to your website?
Yeah, best place to go for all things fearless feedback is joehirsch.me, where I put out tons of resources that you'll be able to use to start making this shift from fear to joy and from feedback to feed forward. I'd love for you to take advantage of some of those materials. I make them all free. Like, what am I hiding them or keeping them for? I want people to get better. I want us to change the dynamic around these conversations. And so everything's there, free of charge. The only cost is that you use it. So I hope you will.
Oh my gosh. I can't thank you enough. I think that at least in my life, you've made a huge impact. And I so appreciate your work and your willingness to put this out there and ask us to think a little differently about not only how we interact with ourselves and how we set up and tee up conversations with others, but also shifting our mindset around the fact that feedback is truly a gift. We're giving a gift. Think of like a Cartier watch or something divine. Like we're really giving the people that we care about or who impact our day-to-day lives something that's going to forever be impactful and helpful to them, but also it helps us grow, right? Because every time we learn how to communicate effectively and from a place of compassion and understanding, it just feeds and nurtures our own soul. We become more expanded as human beings, as leaders, as partners, as mothers, and and community leaders. So thank you so much for sharing everything you did today. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.